Section 4. The Miracle of Purun Bhagat, Part 1. The night we felt the earth would move, we stole and plucked him by the hand, because we loved him with the love that knows but cannot understand. And when the roaring hillside broke, and all our world fell down in rain, we saved him, we the little folk, but lo, he does not come again. Mourn now, we saved him for the sake of such poor love as wild ones may. Mourn ye, our brothers will not wake, and his own kind drive us away. Dirge of the Langurs. There was once a man in India who was Prime Minister of one of the semi-independent native states in the north-western part of the country. He was a Brahmin, so high caste that caste ceased to have any particular meaning for him, and his father had been an important official in the gay-coloured tag-rag and bobtail of an old-fashioned Hindu court. But as Purun Das grew up, he felt that the old order of things was changing, and that if anyone wished to get on in the world, he must stand well with the English, and imitate all that the English believed to be good. At the same time, a native official must keep his own master's favour. This was a difficult game, but the quiet, closed-mouthed young Brahmin, helped by a good English education at a Bombay university, played it coolly and rose step by step to be Prime Minister of the kingdom. That is to say, he held more real power than his master the Maharaja. When the old king, who was suspicious of the English, their railways and telegraphs, died, Purun Das stood high with his young successor, who had been tutored by an Englishman, and between them, though he always took care that his master should have the credit, they established schools for little girls, made roads, and started state dispensaries and shows of agricultural implements, and published a yearly blue book on the moral and material progress of the state. And the Foreign Office and the Government of India were delighted. Very few native states take up English progress altogether, for they will not believe, as Purun Das showed he did, that what was good for the Englishman must be twice as good for the Asiatic. The Prime Minister became the honoured friend of viceroys and governors and lieutenant governors and medical missionaries and common missionaries and the hard-riding English officers who came to shoot in the state preserves, as well as all hosts of tourists who travelled up and down India in the cold weather, showing how things ought to be managed. In his spare time he would endow scholarships for the study of medicine and manufactures on strictly English lines, and write letters to the Pioneer, the greatest Indian daily paper, explaining his master's aims and objects. At last he went to England on a visit, and had to pay enormous sums to the priests when he came back, for even so high a caste a Brahmin as Purun Das lost caste by crossing the Black Sea. In London he met and talked with every one worth knowing, men whose names go all over the world, and saw a great deal more than he said. He was given honorary degrees by learned universities, and he made speeches and talked of Hindu social reform to English ladies in evening dress, till all London cried, "This is the most fascinating man we have ever met at dinner since cloths were first laid." When he returned to India there was a blaze of glory, for the Viceroy himself made a special visit to confer upon the Maharaja the Grand Cross of the Star of India, all diamonds and ribbons and enamel, and at the same ceremony, while the cannon boomed, Purun Das was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Indian Empire, so that his name stood Sir Purun Das, K.C.I.E. That evening at dinner in the big viceregal tent, he stood up with the badge and the collar of the order on his breast, and replying to the toast of his master's health, made a speech few Englishmen could have bettered. Next month, when the city had returned to its sun-baked quiet, he did a thing no Englishman would have dreamed of doing. So far as the world's affairs went, he died. The jewelled order of his knighthood went back to the Indian government, and a new Prime Minister was appointed to the charge of affairs, and a great game of general post began in all the subordinate appointments. The priests knew what had happened, and the people guessed, but India is the one place in the world where a man can do as he pleases and no one asks why. And the fact that Diwan Sir Purun Das, K.C.I.E., had resigned position, palace, and power, and taken up the begging bowl and ochre-coloured dress of a sannyasa, or holy man, was considered nothing extraordinary. He had been, as the old law recommends, 20 years a youth, 20 years a fighter, though he had never carried a weapon in his life, and 20 years head of a household. He had used his wealth and his power for what he knew both to be worth. He had taken honour when it came his way. He had seen men and cities far and near, and men and cities had stood up and honoured him. Now he would let those things go, as a man drops the cloak he no longer needs. Behind him, as he walked through the city gate, an antelope skin and brass-handled crutch under his arm, and a begging bowl of polished brown coco de mer in his hand, barefoot, alone, with eyes cast on the ground, behind him they were firing salutes from the bastions in honour of his happy successor. Purun Das nodded. All that life was ended, and he bore it no more ill will or good will than a man bears to a colourless dream of the night. He was a sannyasi, a houseless, wandering mendicant, depending on his neighbours for his daily bread, and so long as there is a morsel to divide in India, neither priest or beggar starves. He had never in his life tasted meat, and very seldom eaten even fish. A 5-pound note would have covered his personal expenses for food through any of the many years in which he had been absolute master of millions of money. Even when he was being lionized in London, he had held before him his dreams of peace and quiet, the long, white, dusty Indian road, printed all over with bare feet, the incessant, slow-moving traffic, and the sharp-smelling wood smoke curling up under the fig trees in the twilight where the wayfarers sit at their evening meal. When the time came to make that dream true, the Prime Minister took the proper steps, and in 3 days you might more easily have found a bubble in the trough of the long Atlantic seas than Purun Das among the roving, gathering, separating millions of India. At night his antelope skin was spread where the darkness overtook him, sometimes in a sannyasi monastery by the roadside, sometimes by a mud-pillar shrine of Kala Peer, where the yogis, who are another misty division of holy men, would receive him as they do those who know what castes and divisions are worth, sometimes on the outskirts of a little Hindu village where the children would steal up with the food their parents had prepared, and sometimes on the pitch of the bare grazing grounds, where the flame of his stick fire waked the drowsy camels. It was all one to Purun Das, or Purun Bhagat, as he called himself now. Earth, people, and food were all one. But unconsciously his feet drew him away, northward and eastward, from the south to Rohtak, from Rohtak to Kurnool, from Kurnool to ruined Samana, along the dried bed of the Gugger River that fills only when the rain falls in the hills, till one day he saw the far line of the great Himalayas. Then Purun Bhagat smiled, for he remembered that his mother was of Rajput Brahmin birth, from Coolaway, a hill woman always homesick for the snows, and that the least touch of hill blood draws a man in the end back to where he belongs. Yonder, said Purun Bhagat, breasting the lower slopes of the Siwaliks, where the cacti stand up like 7-branched candlesticks, yonder I shall sit down and get knowledge. And the cool wind of the Himalayas whistled about his ears as he trod the road that led to Simla. The last time he had come that way it had been in state, with clattering cavalry escort, to visit the gentlest and most affable of the viceroys, and the two had talked for an hour together about mutual friends in London and what the Indian common folk really thought of things. This time Purun Bhagat paid no calls, but leaned on the rail of them all, watching that glorious view of the plains spread out 40 miles below, till a native Mohammedan policeman told him he was obstructing traffic, and Purun Bhagat salaamed reverently to the law because he knew the value of it, and was seeking for a law of his own. Then he moved on, and slept that night in an empty hut at Chota Simla, which looks like the very last end of the earth, but was only the beginning of his journey. He followed the Himalaya-Tibet road, a little 10-foot track that is blasted out of solid rock, or strutted out on timbers on gulfs over 1,000 feet deep, that dips into warm, wet, shut-in valleys and climbs out across bare, grassy hill shoulders where the sun strikes like a burning glass, or turns through dripping dark forests where the tree ferns dress the trunks from head to heel, and the pheasant calls to his mate, and he met Tibetan herdsmen with their dogs and flocks of sheep, each sheep with a little bag of borax on his back, and wandering woodcutters, and cloaked and blanketed lamas from Tibet coming into India on pilgrimage, and envoys of little solitary hill states, posting furiously on ring-streaked and piebald ponies, or the cavalcade of a Rajah paying a visit, or else for a long clear day he would see nothing more than a black bear grunting and rooting below in the valley. When he first started, the roar of the world he had left still rang in his ears, as the roar of a tunnel rings long after the train has passed through. But when he had put the Matiani Pass behind him, that was all done, and Purun Bhagat was alone with himself, walking, wondering and thinking, his eyes on the ground and his thoughts with the clouds. One evening he passed the highest pass he had met till then. It had been a 2 days' climb, and came out on a line of snow peaks that banded all the horizon. Mountains from 15 to 20,000 feet high, looking almost near enough to hit with a stone, though they were 50 or 60 miles away. The pass was crowned with dense dark forest, deodar, walnut, wild cherry, wild olive and wild pear, but mostly deodar, which is the Himalayan cedar, and under the shadow of the deodars stood a deserted shrine to Kali, who is Durga, who is Sitala, who is sometimes worshipped against the smallpox. Purun Das swept the stone floor clean, smiled at the grinning statue, made himself a little mud fireplace at the back of the shrine, spread his antelope skin on a bed of fresh pine needles, tucked his bairagi, his brass-handled crutch, under his armpit, and sat down to rest. Immediately below him the hillside fell away, clean and cleared for 1,500 feet, where a little village of stone-walled houses, with roofs of beaten earth, clung to the steep tilt. All around it the tiny terraced fields lay out like aprons of patchwork on the knees of the mountain, and cows no bigger than beetles grazed between the smooth stone circles of the threshing floors. Looking across the valley, the eye was deceived by the size of things, and could not at first realize that what seemed to be low scrub on the opposite mountain flank was in truth a forest of 100-foot pines. Purun Bhagat saw an eagle swoop across the gigantic hollow, but the great bird dwindled to a dot ere it was halfway over. A few bands of scattered clouds strung up and down the valley, catching on a shoulder of the hills, or rising up and dying out when they were level with the head of the pass. And "Here shall I find peace," said Purun Bhagat. Now a hillman makes nothing of a few 100 feet up or down, and as soon as the villagers saw the smoke in the deserted shrine, the village priest climbed up the terraced hillside to welcome the stranger. When he met Purun Bhagat's eyes, the eyes of a man used to control thousands, he bowed to the earth, took a begging bowl without a word, and returned to the village, saying, "We have at last a holy man. Never have I seen such a man. He is of the plains, but pale-coloured, a Brahmin of the Brahmins." Then all the housewives of the village said, "Think you he will stay with us?" And each did her best to cook the most savoury meal for the Bhagat. Hill food is very simple, but with buckwheat and Indian corn and rice and red pepper and little fish out of the stream in the valley, and honey from the flue-like hives built in the stone walls, and dried apricots and turmeric and wild ginger and bannocks of flour, a devout woman can make good things, and it was a full bowl that the priest carried to the Bhagat. Was he going to stay? Asked the priest. Would he need a chela, a disciple, to beg for him? Had he a blanket against the cold weather? Was the food good? Purun Bhagat ate and thanked the giver. It was in his mind to stay. That was sufficient, said the priest. Let the begging bowl be placed outside the shrine, in the hollow made by those 2 twisted roots, and daily should the Bhagat be fed. For the village felt honoured that such a man, he looked timidly into the Bhagat's face, should tarry amongst them. Section 5